In this video, we are going to finish discussing Jonathan Glover's paper titled The Sanctity of Life. In the last couple of videos, we were discussing the analysis of this principle of the sanctity of life and how Glover tried to show that there was no real good successful analysis of this principle, what exactly it means. And so before we dig into the rest of Glover's paper, I want to just go ahead and review some of the points that were made with regard to what Glover said, given the four different analyses of the sanctity of life principle that was under consideration. So remember, Glover thought that you might interpret the principle in terms of killing is always wrong. Maybe that's what we mean by it. But there's just obvious counterexamples. There might be situations where killing might be justified. The second one was the claim that, well, killing is directly wrong. But even if somebody believed that that was true, in fact, Glover is going to end up saying at the end of his paper that that is true. But they might believe that without accepting the sanctity of life principle. So that's not going to look like a very good analysis, according to Glover. Then we thought that we considered the claim that the principle of the sanctity of life says that taking life is intrinsically wrong, but that looked like it was vulnerable to counterexamples as well, because what exactly do we mean by life? You know, when I scratch my arm, I'm killing some living skin cells. Does that mean that I've committed some moral atrocity? Probably not. So it's not clear exactly how we're to understand the notion of life there. And so that analysis wasn't going to work as well. And then finally, we talked about, well, maybe what we mean by the sanctity of life principle is just that taking human life is intrinsically wrong. And that looked like it was vulnerable to counterexamples as well, because it's just not clear what we should do with some of the boundary issues involving human life. And what about animal life? Looks like we're going to have to talk about those boundary issues in order to understand what that version, that analysis of the principle means. And so what Glover ended up doing was he considered some of the boundary issues regarding life and death. When is it that somebody is actually dead? And why exactly is it that we value life in the first place? Looks like if we can try to answer the question regarding how or why we value life, then that might help us establish certain boundaries rather than just stipulating those boundaries. And so what Glover thought that shows is that there might be two new ways of considering what exactly is meant by death. Once we get rid of sort of that old, the traditional way of understanding death was when you're not breathing, you don't have a heartbeat and you're not conscious, these sort of things. That was the traditional analysis of death, but that obviously doesn't work because we know we can revive people. So we've got these new criteria. One is the irreversible loss of electrical brain activity, and the second was the irreversible loss of consciousness. Now, both of those criteria are interesting in their own right, and where we left off talking about these criteria was, well, it looks like electrical brain activity is a necessary condition for consciousness. Now, given all of that, it's really important to recognize that Glover thinks that of those two criteria, the irreversible loss of consciousness actually is a better criteria than the irreversible loss of electrical brain activity. And the reason why is because, according to Glover, the only reason why we're even interested in electrical brain activity in the first place is because that's a necessary condition for consciousness. Irreversible loss of brain activity, if that occurs, then you've definitely lost consciousness. And he thinks that it's consciousness that we really care about. And so while the irreversible loss of consciousness is, according to Glover, the better of those two criteria, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work as the right criteria for what it means to count as being dead. So it's just a fact that it's consciousness that we care about, and that's why we even care about electrical brain activity in the first place, but there's going to be counterexamples nonetheless. So some of the counterexamples that we talked about was the case where maybe somebody has had a heart attack and they're unconscious. And before the doctor can revive them, maybe just seconds before they're revived, somebody comes in and stabs that patient, right? Well, in that case, it looks like it should count as murder. But if irreversible loss of consciousness is sufficient, if that's a good definition for what it means to be dead, then that's not murder because the person's unconscious. The person is already dead, if you will. Instead, you might say it's like the illegal tampering with a corpse. But intuitively, that looks like it should count as murder. So that seems to be a counterexample to the irreversible loss of consciousness being a good analysis of what it means to be dead. There's other sort of kind of common sense, intuitive reasons why we might think that this won't work as an analysis of death either. So this is based on sort of the common usage of our language. If, for example, if Smith was a patient and Smith, let's say, was irreversibly comatose, when we talk about Smith, down there in room 322, we don't say the dead patient down in 322. No, we say Smith, the irreversible comatose patient down in 322. And so just kind of the way we generally talk about someone who's completely lost all consciousness suggests that we don't really think of them as being dead. And so that seems like a pretty good reason to reject the irreversible loss of consciousness as an adequate analysis of what it means to be dead. Now, according to Glover, there is what's called, what he calls the double test view. And this is supposed to help us kind of deal with some of these problems with the two different criteria. So what the double test view actually says is that, well, we can check to see if the patient has electrical brain activity. That's one side of the test. And the other side would be to check to see the other systems, such as the circulatory system and the respiratory system. These seem to be pretty crucial for a patient if they're going to count as living. So the double test view is a kind of way to double check to see, make sure before we actually pronounce someone to be dead. Now, this is also problematic insofar as, according to Glover, this is just kind of a practical way, but not a theoretical analysis. It's a pragmatic way of trying to double check to make sure the patient is dead. But it's not going to give us a theoretical analysis of what we actually mean by the concept of death. And Glover thinks that, well, when we're trying to decide, what we're trying to do is actually give a sort of theoretical reform of the concept of death and the concept of the principle of the sanctity of life and so forth. And so how should we decide? What should we do according to Glover? Well, what Glover says is that the only way of choosing is to decide whether or not we attach value to the preservation of someone irreversibly comatose, right? Do we value life, even if unconscious, or do we value life only as a vehicle for consciousness? Our attitude to the doctrine of the sanctity of life very much depends on our answer to this question. And this is where we left off in the last video lectures. I asked you to kind of give your own reasons for your answer to this question. Glover thinks that this question is crucial before we can move forward. So now, of course, Glover thinks that consciousness is really fundamental. That's what's really important here. And he wants to survey some ways in which we can understand consciousness. So the one thing that we might say is that, well, life is a vehicle for consciousness. So different ways we could approach this, but let's ask the question whether or not being alive is what's intrinsically valuable. According to Glover, this is just another kind of moral axiom. There's no good justification for this claim, or at least he doesn't really think that there's one on the offing, right? And so if you're just going to appeal to the claim that being alive is intrinsically valuable without giving any justification, that's no different than pounding your fist and saying, you know, this is just what I believe. I don't have any good reason for it. The other thing that Glover says is he questions whether or not this claim that life is what's intrinsically valuable, whether it's even refutable. If somebody believes this, then is their belief refutable? If it's not refutable, then it might be problematic according to Glover. So it's consciousness that's intrinsically valuable. That's what Glover's aiming at here. That's the direction in which Glover wants to push this point. But then we need to decide, well, what exactly do we mean by consciousness? You know, do we mean mere consciousness, or do we mean some kind of higher order level of consciousness? Now, notice the kind of strategy that's involved in these sort of questions. We started off by talking about giving an analysis of the principle of the sanctity of life, and it looked like no good analysis could come from that. Then we went into a discussion of giving an analysis of what we mean by death. It looked like we had problems giving an analysis of what's meant by death. And now we've gotten to consciousness, and we want to try to figure out, well, what exactly do we mean by consciousness? There's different ways in which one could be conscious, And so presumably there's different forms of consciousness that we could claim are intrinsically valuable. So when we say that consciousness is intrinsically valuable, Glover thinks that we need to be more specific and talk about whether it's mere consciousness or whether it's some kind of higher order level of consciousness that we're trying to say is intrinsically valuable. Now, let me say something about what exactly is meant by mere consciousness versus higher order level of consciousness. Mere consciousness is like it's being sentient. It's being aware of your environment, being able to experience the world around you, sort of having that qualitative feeling, like when you see the color blue, it's the blueness, that sort of primitive blueness, phenomenal blue that you experience, and that there's not much else you can say. It's sort of that that qualitative feeling, that raw feeling you have. That's sort of like mere consciousness, right? Another way I like to think about it sometimes is, imagine yourself outside and you feel the cold breeze on the back of your neck, or you feel the warm sunshine on your forehead. There's a feeling, a raw feeling that's associated with that. Or think about pain. You stub your toe, or you break your arm or something. There's a certain amount of pain that's associated with that. That quality, that raw feeling is what we kind of mean by sentience or mere consciousness. Now that's different from a higher order level of consciousness. You might think that higher order consciousness is being able to think about your own thoughts, sort of being able to recognize pain as being a bad thing, being able to have a concept of the self. Right? These are different ways of describing a higher order level of consciousness. And so there's clearly two different ways in which we could think about consciousness according to Glover. So if you believe that consciousness is what's intrinsically valuable, then we have a further question, namely, well, is it mere consciousness or this higher order level of consciousness that we find to be of intrinsic value? So now let's think about why somebody might claim that it's mere consciousness that we intrinsically value, why we think that is what's intrinsically valuable. The kind of sort of case that Glover considers involves what's sometimes described as a philosophical zombie. It's a thought experiment where we have a subject who's exactly like you and me in every single respect, except for this philosophical zombie doesn't have consciousness, doesn't have that sort of mere consciousness, that phenomenological feeling, that raw feeling that we all recognize as being, phenomenally conscious, right? So a philosophical zombie has every single thing that you have. If you ask the philosophical zombie, did it hurt when you stubbed your toe? The philosophical zombie will say, yes, it did. So the philosophical zombie will respond as if it has mere consciousness, but we are just going to stipulate that the philosophical zombie does not have consciousness. So what Glover says on this point is, we might be asked to imagine two universes identical except that one contained a being aware of its environment and the other did not. It may be suggested that the universe containing conscious beings would be intrinsically better, right? That's another way of saying that's the one we would value more. And so that's kind of one way in which somebody might argue for the claim that it's mere consciousness that we find to be intrinsically valuable. However, there's problems with this thought experiment. First of all, you might think that there's problems with just the way the thought experiment is set up. How in the world are we supposed to even imagine what a world would be like without mere consciousness? That's trying to imagine something that's just that kind of lack, that sort of absence. What's lacking, what's absent in the case is it's so fundamental to us, to our world, that it's not clear that we can even imagine such a world. And so that kind of seemed to be problematic for the thought experiment itself. Nonetheless, Glover does admit that, yeah, we probably would prefer a world with consciousness, mere consciousness, over a world with only philosophical zombies. But you might think that, there's just problems with the thought experiment. You also might think that there's problems concerning non-human animals. Sort of, where do we draw the line? Where's the degree between the kind of consciousness that we enjoy and the kind of consciousness that other non-human animals enjoy? The phylogenetic, tree, if you will, is full of different levels or degrees of consciousness. Maybe an ape or a chimpanzee has a certain level of consciousness. Maybe dolphins and elephants and pigs and cows do too, maybe dogs and cats and so forth. But how far down do you have to go before you start saying, well, this level of consciousness is intrinsically valuable, but this other level is not? So that's an empirical question, and it's just not clear where we would draw the line. And so that's going to be a problem for anybody who tries to argue this way. Another problem that we might think about is degrees of consciousness within human beings, right? So, you wake up in the morning and you are conscious, but then if you take a nap or when you go to sleep later at night, you're unconscious. Or you might think that there's certain times throughout your day where you're daydreaming and you're like in this weird fuzzy level of consciousness, right? Sometimes, I'll be driving to campus, and the next thing I know, I realize that I've driven for about 10 minutes, and it's like, well, what just happened in that 10 minutes? Clearly I was conscious in some level because I was driving that whole time, but it's such a routine drive that I'm sort of like on automatic pilot. And so it's not clear that I was fully alert or fully aware. And so you might think that within human beings, there's these levels or degrees of consciousness as well. Now, what Glover does, in addition to suggesting that there's these sort of problems, is Glover offers an argument against the claim that mere consciousness is intrinsically valuable. So here's how this argument goes. The first premise says, well, if the whole basis of the ban on killing were the intrinsic value of mere consciousness, then killing higher order non-human animals, such as a chimpanzee or a dolphin or an elephant, or maybe even a dog or a cat, well, then killing these non-human animals would be just as bad or morally wrong as killing humans. But, second premise says, it is not the case that killing non-human animals is just as morally bad as killing humans. So the kind of situation that we're trying to imagine here is, say that there's a house that's burning and your dog is inside the house and your mother's inside the house, or maybe just your neighbor's inside the house. Of the two people that you can save, let's just stipulate you can only save one. Presumably you would save, the human being rather than the dog. And the reason why is because we think that there's something intrinsically more valuable about the human being than about the dog. Now, we might want to save the dog, but if we can only save one of the two, then we would probably save the human being. If the first premise is true, if it really is the case that there's no clear way to distinguish between the intrinsic value or worth of the dog versus the human being, then it wouldn't be morally wrong to kill one instead of the other. And so if we saved the dog instead of your neighbor, that wouldn't be morally wrong. There would be nothing morally problematic with that. But intuitively, we think that there is something wrong with that. We think that you should save the human being rather than the dog if you could only save one of the two. So that's all the second premise is really saying. It's just that it's not the case that non-human animals, it's not the case that killing non-human animals is just as morally wrong as killing humans. Instead, we think that killing humans is morally worse than killing a non-human animal. Therefore, we're able to deny the antecedent of the conditional in the first premise, right? So it's not the case that the basis of the ban on killing is the intrinsic value of mere consciousness. And so that's the general argument that that Glover presents in favor of the claim that mere consciousness is not the thing that we think is intrinsically valuable. So being human might be what we think is intrinsically valuable. That's another way in which Glover argues. He wants to consider whether or not this would work. Well, it's not simply having mere consciousness that we think is intrinsically valuable. Rather, it's being a human being with mere consciousness that we think is intrinsically valuable. But this has another problem with regard to speciesism. Why is it that we would say that human beings are better than other animals that have mere consciousness? Or we might think about it in terms of an extraterrestrial alien, right? Or a Martian or something. If an alien comes down and turns out that they have mere consciousness and they're able to think and to reason and so forth, they're very similar to us. What's the difference between them being, in some sense, a moral agent versus being food, right? So why should we play favoritism for human beings? That's kind of this notion of speciesism. And so claiming that human beings, being a human being is what's intrinsically valuable, that seems to be committed to a form of speciesism that, according to Glover, just isn't justified. And so what Glover thinks is that that shows us that higher order consciousness is what's really intrinsically valuable, right? We've gone through a number of different problems with the claim that mere consciousness is intrinsically valuable. We've presented an argument against the claim that mere consciousness is intrinsically valuable. And now we've shown that being human is intrinsically valuable won't work either, because it seems to commit us to this claim that, or this view of speciesism. And so that's where we leave off, is Glover thinks that it's higher order consciousness that is intrinsically valuable. So it seems like we're starting to get somewhere. Glover thinks that we now have a way to provide a kind of a replacement for the sanctity of life principle. And that's going to be appealing to what Glover calls the concept of a life worth living. And so the next video, we're going to talk in more detail about why Glover thinks this principle is a way to replace the principle of sanctity of life. And we're going to consider some potential objections to what Glover says regarding this principle of a life worth living. So that's what we will do in the next video.